The calendar showed May 27, 1940, but for the British Army in France it seemed like the end of the world. Dawn in the village of L'Épinette brought not the sun, but an eerie silence, broken only by the distant and terrifying roar of diesel engines. The strategic situation was a nightmare. Nazi Germany was not only winning, blitzkrieg, it was devouring Europe. Poland had fallen in 36 days. Now the Panzers were tearing through the interior of France at 60 kilometers a day. The British Expeditionary Force was in total collapse, a mass of exhausted men rushing towards the sea, praying to reach the beaches of Dunkirk before they were annihilated. On the roads, discipline was crumbling. Officers burned secret codes in muddy ditches. Sergeants buried heavy artillery they couldn't carry. Privates, seized by panic, threw their Enfield rifles into the mud just to be lighter and run faster. The army was on the run. But hidden behind a moss-covered stone wall near an abandoned barn, Captain Jack Churchill wasn't running. And he was the only thing on that battlefield that didn't make the slightest sense. As the most modern army in history advanced toward him, Jack wasn't holding a Bren machine gun. He wasn't holding a sniper rifle. His hands, steady as rocks, held an English longbow made of yew wood, nearly 2 meters tall. It was a scene of temporal rupture. On one side, the Wehrmacht, professional soldiers equipped with MP-40 submachine guns, supported by steel tanks and radios. On the other, a 33-year-old man holding technology from 1415. The morning mist began to dissipate, revealing 5 grey silhouettes. A German patrol. Jack observed them from 50 meters away, then from 40. He could see the sergeant leading the group. He was a veteran, you could tell by the way he moved, cautious, scanning windows, bushes, rooftops. The German sergeant was looking for the dangers of modern warfare, the glint of a scope, the barrel of a machine gun, the wire of a trap. His brain had never been trained to look for a medieval archer. At 30 meters, Jack Churchill stood silently. He pulled the bowstring to his ear. The wood creaked softly under 30 kilograms of accumulated tension. Jack wasn't just trying his luck. A year earlier, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. He could hit a playing card at that distance. Hitting a man in the chest was a mathematical certainty. Time seemed to freeze. The German sergeant glanced toward the wall, perhaps sensing movement, but it was too late. Jack let go of the rope. There was no bang, the deafening sound of a gunshot. There was no flash. There was only death whack, the dryness of the string, and the deadly hiss of the air being cut. The arrow flew faster than thought. It crossed the space between ages and buried itself deep in the Nazi sergeant's chest. The man fell instantly without even screaming. The silence that followed was terrifying. The other 4 German soldiers froze. They stared at their leader's body, seeing a wooden rod sticking out of him. And for a second, their brains couldn't process the information. Were they in 1940 or the 100 Years' War? That moment went down in history as a statistical anomaly. It was the first confirmed kill by bow and arrow in a European war in centuries. And it would be the last of the entire Second World War. Jack Churchill gave the signal for his men to attack with the phrase that would define his career. He proved that, even against the most advanced war machine in the world, human audacity and good aim were still lethal. To understand why a man would take a bow and arrow to confront Nazi Germany, you need to understand that the British Army simply didn't know what to do with Jack Churchill. He was a problem that wasn't in the textbooks. Jack had graduated from the prestigious Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1926, the cradle of the military elite. He was sent to serve in Burma with the Manchester Regiment, but quickly discovered a fatal problem in his career: peace. For most men, war is hell on earth. For Jack, peace was unbearable. The routine of polishing buttons, marching in ceremonial parades, and filling out bureaucratic reports bored him to the core. He felt like he was rotting alive. In 1936, he did the unthinkable for a career officer. He resigned. He needed to feel alive, and the army couldn't offer that. In the following years, Jack's life seemed like the script of an adventure film rejected for being too exaggerated. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya, facing the African wilderness. He became a professional model. He even went into film, appearing in the classic The Thief of Baghdad and A Yank at Oxford. But he wasn't just any extra. He used his real skills with the bow and bagpipes on screen. His thirst for adrenaline was insatiable. In one famous episode, he rode across the entire country of India on a motorcycle, a 2,400-kilometer journey along treacherous dirt roads. The trip only ended when he violently collided with a half-ton water buffalo. He survived, repaired the motorcycle, and continued. He needed danger like the rest of us need oxygen. But then, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The world held its breath. Jack Churchill smiled. He rushed back to the barracks to re-enlist. But the man who returned was no longer the starched officer from Sandhurst. While his colleagues received their new uniforms, service Webley revolvers and tactical maps, Jack brought his own personal baggage. He brought the English longbow made of yew wood, with which he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway, in 1939. He wasn't an amateur playing Robin Hood. He was an elite athlete, capable of hitting targets at distances most soldiers could barely see. He brought a complete set of bagpipes from the Highlands, an instrument he had taught himself to play and which he considered essential for morale. And hanging from his belt, he carried the item that most frightened his own companions, a sword. It wasn't a fine ceremonial sword, the kind used in military weddings. It was a heavy Scottish claymore with a basket-hilted hilt, a wide and brutal blade made for cutting limbs and breaking bones. It was the weapon his ancestors had used to fight in the Scottish mountains centuries ago. Jack's arrival at the barracks caused a culture shock. His comrades looked at him with a mixture of fascination and horror. Senior officers thought he was a liability, a dangerous responsibility. Some whispered that he was clinically insane. The War Office in London went into a bureaucratic panic. There simply were no regulations for officers who wanted to face armored Panzer divisions and 18mm guns using medieval steel. But Jack Churchill wasn't crazy. He was an obsessive student of military history and had a brutal tactical logic behind his eccentricity. He knew the statistics. He knew that a German Mauser rifle shot farther than his bow. He knew that an MG-42 machine gun fired 200 rounds per minute and could cut a man in half. He perfectly understood the technological disadvantage. But he also knew something that modern generals had forgotten: the absolute power of fear. Modern warfare was impersonal and mechanical. You die from a bullet fired 300 meters away by someone you can't even see. The brain of a German soldier is exhaustively trained to react to gunfire, mortars, and grenades. He has a mental protocol for it. But how does the human brain react when it sees a man emerging from the smoke, swinging a giant sword above his head, screaming like a Celtic demon while playing bagpipes? There's no training for that. The brain freezes. The enemy hesitates, trying to process if it's real. And in hand-to-hand combat, a second of hesitation is the difference between life and death. Jack Churchill wasn't carrying a sword into a firefight because he thought it was a technically superior weapon. He carried it because it was a weapon of psychological terror. It was during this time, while sharpening his claymore in the barracks under the incredulous gazes of the recruits, that he uttered the phrase that would define his existence. Any officer who goes into action without his sword isn't properly dressed. After the miracle of the Dunkirk evacuation, where Jack covered his men's retreat by firing arrows at the advancing Germans, most soldiers would have been grateful to be alive and requested a bureaucratic role far from the front. Jack Churchill was not the majority. He heard rumors that the army was forming a new special unit. The training would be sadistic. The missions would be suicidal. The objective was to spread terror in occupied Europe. They called themselves the Commandos. Jack volunteered immediately. It was the perfect home for him. The training in the Scottish Highlands was brutal, designed to break men physically and mentally. But while soldiers 10 years younger collapsed from exhaustion, Jack marched at the front, often playing his bagpipes to keep the beat, carrying his sword and bow. By 1941, he was no longer just an eccentric. He was second in command of No. 3 Squadron. And then came December 27th, 1941, Operation Archery. The target was the island of Vågsøy in Norway. The objective, to destroy German coastal artillery batteries and blow up fish oil factories that the Nazis used to make explosives. The scene was a soldier's nightmare. It was the Arctic winter. The sea was black and rough. Landing craft cut through the icy waves toward the shore, rocking violently. Suddenly, the sky lit up. The cruiser HMS Kenya opened fire with its heavy guns to cover the approach. Gigantic explosions shook the beach. The air filled with smoke, the smell of cordite, and the deafening sound of naval warfare. Inside the landing craft, the British commandos were crouched, pale with tension, gripping their rifles tightly, praying that the ramp would lower before a mortar hit them. They sought any inch of protection the boat's steel could offer, all except one. At the bow of the lead boat, completely exposed to the Arctic wind and the sights of the German snipers, stood Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill. He was standing. He wasn't wearing a helmet. And, in the midst of that artillery inferno, he began to play music. Jack inflated the bellows of his instrument, and the high-pitched, shrill notes of Cameron's Men's March cut through the noise of battle. Imagine being a German soldier in that bunker. You're looking through the scope of your machine gun. You expect to see soldiers running, hiding. Instead, you hear Scottish folk music growing louder and louder. You see a man standing in front of the boat, calm, as if he were in a parade in Edinburgh. The mental confusion in the German defenses was absolute. It didn't register. The boat scraped against the gravel on the beach. The ramp collapsed with a metallic thud. The music stopped. Jack put down his harmonica, pulled the pin on a grenade, and hurled it toward the enemy positions. Before the explosion even occurred, he drew his claymore sword. Shouting, "Commandos!" he ran alone toward the smoke and machine guns. It was such a terrifying and inspiring sight that the other soldiers lost their fear. They followed Crazy Jack up the beach with a ferocity that the Germans could not contain. Within minutes, the batteries were silenced. The German garrison was swept away. Jack emerged from the battle without a single scratch. His harmonica was intact, his sword was stained. But the real impact wasn't just the destruction of the factory. It was what happened in Adolf Hitler's mind. When reports reached Berlin, describing the ferocity of the attack and the mad officer who led it, Hitler became paranoid. He believed that this attack was the prelude to a full-scale invasion of Norway. As a result, he diverted 30,000 soldiers, elite troops for Norway, soldiers who could have fought in Russia or Africa. Jack Churchill and his sword essentially tied down an entire army using pure psychological warfare. He proved that insanity, when well applied, is a valid military strategy. The legend of Mad Jack had already circulated as a myth in the corridors of military intelligence, but it was in Italy, in September 1943, that he transcended the barrier of eccentric to become unbelievable. The scene was the bloody Battle of Salerno. The Allied invasion was stalled. British troops were being ground down near the town of Pigoletti. The problem had a name, Point 677. It was a fortified observation post atop a hill from where German observers directed a precise and devastating rain of mortars upon any Allied soldier who attempted to move. The military manuals dictated a clear solution to this problem: call in an airstrike or send an entire company of 150 men to take the hill with suppressive fire. Jack Churchill looked at the rugged terrain, looked at the falling night, and decided the manual was too slow. He dismissed the battalion. He dismissed the artillery support. He turned to a single man, Corporal Ruffle, and said, "Grab your belt. We're going up there." It was a suicide mission by definition. 2 men against an entire elite garrison. They left the British lines and plunged into the absolute darkness of the Italian countryside. The silence was total, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of explosions. Jack wasn't carrying a rifle. In his heavy, cold right hand was his Scottish claymore. They moved like ghosts through vineyards and drainage ditches, crawling inches at a time so as not to alert the sentries. Jack's plan depended on one thing: pure terror. They reached the first German machine gun post. The darkness was so dense that Jack could smell the tobacco from German cigarettes before he saw the soldiers. The sentries were relaxed. They expected a noisy army, tanks, shouts. They were unprepared for what happened next. Jack rose from the shadows, appearing out of nowhere less than a meter away. The blade of his sword caught a ray of moonlight. He didn't shoot. He shouted a guttural, authoritative command: "Hands up! Hands up!" The psychology of that moment is fascinating. If Jack had pointed a gun, the German soldier, trained for years, might have tried to react or seek cover. The brain understands firearms. But an enemy officer emerging from the darkness with a medieval sword at his throat? That broke their mental conditioning. The primal fear of being cut or beheaded paralyzed the sentries' nervous systems. They froze and surrendered immediately without firing a shot. But what Jack did next is what made that night legendary. Most soldiers would have grabbed the 2 prisoners and run back to base, not Jack. He decided to play a dangerous game of human dominoes. He tied the prisoner's hands and pressed the tip of his sword against his back. "Walk," he ordered. He used the captured German as a human shield and bait to approach the next combat post. The next sentry saw a comrade approaching in the darkness and lowered his guard. By the time he realized his mistake, Jack was already there. His sword gleamed. The cry echoed. More surrenders. He repeated this insane process, post by post, trench by trench. He dismantled the German defense from the inside out. The Germans were so confused, so disoriented by fear and the authority of that demon with the sword, that the entire unit collapsed psychologically. Nobody knew how many British soldiers were there. They thought they were surrounded by a silent special force. As the sun rose over the Salerno Valley, the British sentries on the lower lines rubbed their eyes, thinking they were hallucinating. Coming down the hill, with the calm posture of someone returning from a walk in the park, was Jack Churchill. Beside him, the exhausted Corporal Ruffle, and marching ahead of them, carrying their own weapons and ammunition boxes, obedient as sheep, were 42 German prisoners. He had captured an entire platoon. He had neutralized Point 677. He had captured a whole mortar squad. 42 men armed with MP-40 submachine guns surrendered to a man with a sword and a handler with a revolver. When a stunned superior officer asked Jack how he had accomplished such a miracle without firing a single shot, Jack cleaned the blade of his sword and replied with the most British phrase possible: "I maintain the opinion that if you shout loud and clear enough to a German, he will obey." In May 1944, the legendary luck that had protected Jack Churchill seemed to have finally reached its limit. The war had changed, and he was sent to Yugoslavia to coordinate attacks with the partisans against the German occupying forces. The terrain on the island of Brač was brutal, mountainous and unforgiving. The plan was a coordinated attack, but at the crucial moment, under heavy fire, support failed. Jack Churchill and a small group of commandos found themselves alone on a hilltop, exposed, attacking fortified positions without cover. The German response was devastating. A hail of mortars rained down on Jack's position. One by one, his men were hit. The air filled with shrapnel and smoke. Within minutes, their ammunition ran out. Jack was the only man still standing. The German soldiers began to climb the slope to finish off the survivors. Any other soldier would have raised his hands or tried to run. Jack Churchill did something that defies comprehension and self-preservation. He realized that this was the end. So he sheathed his sword and drew his bagpipes for the last time. As grenades exploded around him, he stood alone among the bodies of his friends and began to play an old, mournful melody. Will ye no come back again? You won't come back again. It was a Scottish lament, a farewell. The German soldiers climbing the hill stopped. The sight of that British officer covered in dirt and blood, playing music amidst the massacre, was almost sacred, too surreal to interrupt. For a brief moment, the war paused to listen. The music only ceased when a German grenade exploded right behind Jack, throwing him against the rocks and knocking him unconscious. Nazi intelligence was ecstatic to capture him. Upon seeing the surname Churchill, they believed they had caught a relative of the Prime Minister, although they were not related. He was sent to the dreaded Sachsenhausen concentration camp. But capturing Jack Churchill was like trying to trap a hurricane in a cardboard box. In September 1944, he and an RAF pilot dug a secret tunnel using rusty tin cans and spoons. They crawled under barbed wire and almost reached the Baltic Sea before being recaptured. Jack didn't give up. In April 1945, while being transferred to another camp in Austria, the lighting failed during a moment of chaos. Taking advantage of the darkness, Jack simply left the line and ran into the forest. This time, he didn't stop. He walked 50 kilometers crossing the Alps, alone, without food, without a map, guided only by the stars and stealing vegetables from farms to avoid starvation. 8 days later, an American patrol saw a strange figure descending the mountain. It was Jack, dirty, thin, but alive. The war in Europe ended days later, but Jack's reaction to the end of the conflict perfectly sums up who he was. While the world celebrated peace after the atomic bombs, Jack was genuinely angry. He felt he had been robbed of more battles. He turned to his friends and uttered the phrase that would conclude his military legend. If it weren't for those damn Yankees, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. Jack lived until 1996, dying peacefully at the age of 89 after spending his retirement surfing the waves of English rivers. He was a man born in the wrong era, a medieval warrior lost in the 20th century who proved that no technology can surpass human audacity. And now I want to know your opinion. Do you think Jack Churchill was a courageous hero or an irresponsible madman? Write hero or madman in the comments and I'll read everything. If this story surprised you, smash the like button right now. It really helps the channel. And subscribe and activate the bell because in the next video we're going to talk about an even more unbelievable battle. Until next time.